When I was about 8 years old, I lived with my dad and older brother in a rented house near the edge of a small town in Ohio. It was the kind of neighborhood where everyone knew everyone, where people left their garage doors open during the day and nobody thought twice about it. My dad worked night shifts at a factory about 40 minutes away, so most evenings it was just me and my brother Marcus, who was 12. I remember feeling safe there, mostly. But there was one part of the house I never liked, and I could never explain why. It was the hallway. Not the whole hallway, just the end of it. The house was shaped in an L, and the bedrooms were at the far end of the longer part. My room was the last one before the wall, and at night, when the lights were off, the end of that hallway looked like a hole. Like the darkness there was thicker than it should have been. I told myself it was just because there was no window at that end. I told myself shadows were shadows. But even on my way to the bathroom in the middle of the night, I would sprint the last few feet back to my room and slam the door. I never once looked back down the hall after the lights went out. The first time something actually happened, I was 7. I woke up around 3 in the morning because I heard breathing, not my own. It was slow and even, coming from near the foot of my bed. I told myself it was Marcus. He sometimes came in when he had nightmares, even though he'd never admit it. I whispered his name and nothing answered. The breathing kept going. I pulled my blanket up and stared at the ceiling until sunrise. In the morning, my door was open, and I always slept with it closed. Didn't say anything for weeks. Kids have a way of burying things they can't explain. I started sleeping with a flashlight under my pillow, which made me feel slightly better, even though I never actually used it. Then, one night, I did. I woke up, and the room felt wrong. The air was cold, the kind of cold that has weight to it, and there was a smell I still can't fully describe. Something like wet stone or old water. I reached under my pillow and turned on the flashlight and swept it across the room. Nothing. I almost laughed. I swung it toward the door, and the door was open, and there was a figure standing in the hallway. It was tall. Too tall for Marcus, too tall for my dad. It stood just outside the door frame, in that thick dark at the end of the hall, and it wasn't moving. I couldn't see a face. I couldn't see hands. It was just a long shape, standing there, and the only reason I knew it wasn't a shadow was that shadows don't block the light behind them. I clicked off my flashlight. I don't know why. Maybe I thought if I couldn't see it, it couldn't see me. I stayed like that for what felt like an hour, and eventually exhaustion won. I fell asleep with the flashlight gripped in both hands. In the morning, I told Marcus. He didn't laugh. He got quiet in a way I hadn't seen before and said he'd heard footsteps in the hall the week before. He said they stopped right outside his door and didn't continue. He said he'd assumed it was me. We looked at each other the way kids look at each other when they both know something is wrong but neither wants to say it out loud. He told me not to tell Dad. He said Dad would just say we were being babies. After that, we started leaving the hallway light on at night. Dad thought the bulb was just burning out fast because we'd replace it every few weeks. He never asked why we were using it so much. The footsteps came back. Not every night, but enough. Always the same pattern. They'd start at the far end of the hall, near the door that led to the laundry room, and they'd walk slow and steady toward our rooms. Marcus started sleeping with his door locked. I started sleeping in his room on the floor. The worst night came in November. There was a storm, the kind that knocks the power out and makes the whole house groan. Dad was at work. Marcus and I were in his room with candles and a board game we weren't really playing. The storm was loud enough that we almost didn't hear the footsteps, but then we both froze at the same second. We heard them, right outside his door. Then a knock. 3 slow knocks. Marcus grabbed my arm. I remember the candle flickering even though we were nowhere near it. We didn't answer. The knocking stopped. We didn't sleep. When my dad got home in the morning, we told him everything. And I mean everything. The breathing, the figure in the doorway, the footsteps, the knocking. He sat at the kitchen table and listened without interrupting, which wasn't like him. When we finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then he told us that 2 weeks after we moved in, a neighbor had mentioned in passing that an older man had lived in the house before us. He'd lived alone for years and years. And he'd died in the house, in the hallway, actually. He'd fallen and wasn't found for several days. My dad had never told us because he thought it was irrelevant. He said dead people were just dead people and we were being dramatic. But then he said he was going to call the landlord about getting a second lock on the laundry room door. He never explained why that specifically. I never asked. We moved out 6 months later. He said it was because the commute was too long. Maybe that was true. But I noticed he stopped walking down that hallway at night too. He started going around through the kitchen instead. Every single time. I noticed, Marcus noticed. Neither of us said anything about it. I'm 29 now, and I still sleep with the bedroom door closed and a light on somewhere in the house. My girlfriend thinks it's a quirky habit. I've never told her why. Some things are easier to keep as quirks than explain as memories. But sometimes when the house is quiet and she's asleep and I'm lying there looking at the ceiling, I think about that hallway, about the shape standing in the dark, about my dad and the route he chose to take through the kitchen. I think about how the people who are supposed to protect you sometimes protect you by saying nothing. And I wonder if that's better or worse than knowing. I still don't have an answer for that. I need to start by saying I was not a kid who scared easily. I grew up in a big house in rural Pennsylvania with 4 siblings, 2 dogs, and a grandmother who told horror stories at dinner the way other grandmothers told Bible verses. Fear was just another thing at the table, and like everything else at that table, you ate it and moved on. So when I tell you what started happening when I was 11, I want you to understand the baseline. I was not looking for this. I was not the type. We moved to that house in the summer. It was older, built sometime in the early 1900s, and my parents had bought it as a project. There was always something being repaired, something being repainted, some wall being opened up to check the wiring. For the first few months, it felt less like a home and more like a construction site, which meant there were always strange sounds, and I always had somewhere else to put them. A bang in the wall was a pipe. A creak upstairs was someone walking. Easy. Rational. Fine. But then the construction stopped, and the house got quiet, and that's when I started to notice Thursday. It took me a while to realize it was a pattern. The first few times, I just thought I was tired or that the house was settling. But by October, I had started keeping a small notebook on my nightstand, the kind kids use for homework, and I was writing things down. Every Thursday night, without exception, I would wake up between 2 and 3 in the morning. Not gradually, the way you wake up when you have to use the bathroom, suddenly. Like something had pulled me up from sleep by the collar. I would be completely awake, heart going fast, staring at the ceiling. And then I would hear it. Footsteps in the attic. Our attic was directly above my bedroom. It was full of boxes and old furniture and dust and nothing else. My dad had checked when we moved in, checking for animals, and found nothing. No access from outside except a small vent that was fully screened. But every Thursday, without exception, I heard footsteps up there. Slow, deliberate, walking a specific path, back and forth, from one side of the attic to the other, like someone pacing. I told my older sister, Claire, and she thought I was messing with her until she slept in my room one Thursday to prove me wrong. She lasted until about 2:30 before she came and woke our parents up and said there was an animal in the attic. My dad went up with a flashlight and found nothing. He checked for droppings, for nesting, for any sign of entry. Nothing. He came back down and told us the house was old and we were hearing it breathe. Claire never slept in my room again, and she never brought it up. But she also started giving me a look when Thursdays came around. A specific look, like she was acknowledging something she wasn't willing to name. By December, the footsteps had changed. They weren't just back and forth anymore. Some Thursdays, they would stop right above my bed. Just stop, directly overhead, and stay still. I would stare up at the ceiling and feel the weight of whatever was standing there, and I know how that sounds, but that's the only way I can describe it. A weight, a presence, a thing that stood in the dark above me and was aware that I was in the dark below it. I started sleeping on the couch in the living room on Wednesday nights so I wouldn't have to be in my room when Thursday hit. My parents thought I was going through a phase. Maybe I was. Maybe kids go through phases where they avoid their bedrooms because something paces above them in the dark. Maybe that's normal, and I just didn't know it. The Thursday that changed everything was in February. I had fallen asleep on the couch as usual, but something woke me up earlier than normal. Midnight, maybe. The house was completely dark. I lay there for a moment trying to figure out what had pulled me awake, and then I saw her. She was standing at the end of the hallway that led to the bedrooms. I could see her because the hallway got a thin strip of light from the street lamp outside, and she was standing right in it. She was a woman, short, gray-haired, wearing a long dark dress or robe or something that came down to her feet. She was facing away from me, looking toward the bedrooms, perfectly still. I lay on the couch and did not move and did not breathe and watched her. She stood there for what I can only estimate was 2 minutes. Then she turned her head, not her whole body, just her head, and she looked directly at me over her shoulder. Her face was in shadow. I couldn't make out features, but I could tell she was looking at me. Then she turned back and walked toward the bedrooms. Not floated, not glided. Walked with footsteps, heels clicking on the wood floor all the way down the hall. And then she was gone. No doors opened, no sound stopped. I did not sleep, I did not scream, I did not move until my mom came out at 6 to start the coffee. I told her everything. She sat and listened, and when I finished, she asked me what I'd eaten before bed. I told her whatever it was I ate every night, and she patted my hand and said growing kids had vivid dreams. I didn't argue. There was no point. The following Thursday, I was in my room, because honestly, the couch felt less safe than it had before, and the footsteps came, as always, back and forth above me. But when they stopped above my bed this time, I heard something I hadn't heard before. Through the ceiling, faint but clear, I heard humming. A low, tuneless kind of hum, the kind someone makes when they are doing a task and not really thinking about it. It lasted about 30 seconds, and then it stopped, and the footsteps resumed and eventually faded. We lived in that house for 4 more years. The Thursdays kept coming until about a year before we moved, and then they just stopped. No explanation, no final event. They just ended. I asked Claire once, after we were both adults, if she remembered that night in my room. She said yes. I asked her what she thought the sound was. She looked out the window for a second and then said, "I think it was the house." And then she changed the subject. I didn't push her. Some people need the explanation more than they need the truth. I get it. I've been there too. But I know what I heard, and I know what I saw at the end of that hallway. And I know it was a Thursday. This one isn't about my house. It happened outside, in the middle of the day, in plain sight, and somehow that makes it harder to dismiss than anything else I've ever experienced. Because the dark gives you an excuse. Nighttime gives you a way out. You can say you were half asleep, you can say the shadows played tricks, you can say your brain was filling in gaps the way brains do. But this happened in October sunlight on a Wednesday afternoon when I was 10 years old and completely awake. I took the bus home from school every day. The stop was about a block and a half from my house, at the corner of 2 streets that I could never tell apart because they both had the same skinny oak trees and the same cracked sidewalk and the same mailboxes shaped like little houses. I'd stand at that corner for anywhere between 5 and 15 minutes every afternoon, depending on traffic, depending on the driver, depending on whatever. I was used to it. I had my routine. I'd drop my bag on the curb, eat whatever snack I'd saved from lunch, and watch the neighborhood. That's when I started seeing the boy. He first appeared in late September, maybe the second week of school. He was standing on the opposite side of the street, maybe 30 feet from the corner. I noticed him because he was wearing a jacket that seemed too heavy for the weather, one of those old-style wool things that you saw more in old photographs than in real life, dark green with big buttons. He was about my age, maybe a year older. He had light brown hair and he was just standing there, watching the street, not looking at me specifically, just watching. I didn't think much of it that first day. Lots of kids in the neighborhood walked home. He was probably just waiting for something, but he was there the next day. Same spot, same jacket, same posture, hands at his sides, watching the street. And the day after that. For 2 full weeks, every afternoon when I got off the bus, the boy was standing across the street in the same spot. He never crossed over. He never walked anywhere. He never waved or called out or did anything that kids do when they're bored and standing on a sidewalk waiting for something. He just stood there. I started paying closer attention. I noticed he was always there when I arrived and I never saw him leave. Once, I deliberately took longer than usual, pretending to search through my bag, and I looked up every minute or so. He was there. And then I looked up, and he wasn't. No one had passed. No car had stopped. He was there, and then he simply wasn't. I walked home fast that day. I mentioned him to my friend Danny, who took the same bus and got off at the stop after mine. I described the jacket, the spot, the habit. Danny frowned and said he'd never seen anyone like that near that corner. I told him to look next time. He said he would. The next day, Danny got off at my stop to check, which he wasn't supposed to do. We stood at the corner and I pointed across the street and the boy was there, same as always, standing in the same spot with the same jacket and the same expression that wasn't really an expression. Danny looked at me and said he didn't see anyone. I looked at Danny and then looked back at the boy and said, "Right there, the kid in the green jacket right there." Danny squinted across the street and said there was nobody there. I looked at him for a long time. He wasn't pretending. Danny was not a good enough actor to fake that kind of confusion. I looked back at the boy. The boy looked back at me. That was the first time I felt like he was actually looking at me specifically. Not the street. Me. I told my mom that night, and she walked to the corner with me the following afternoon. The boy was not there. He wasn't there the next day either, or the day after. I thought maybe it was over, whatever it was. I thought maybe he'd just been some neighborhood kid I'd built a story around because I was bored and 10 years old and kids do that. Then, in late October, about 3 weeks after he disappeared, I saw him again. Same spot, same jacket, even though it was colder now and every other kid in the neighborhood was wearing a winter coat. I stared at him. He stared back, and then he raised his hand, slowly, and waved at me. One wave. Small, deliberate. The kind of wave someone gives when they're saying goodbye and they know it. I did not wave back. I grabbed my bag and walked home without looking back once. He was never there again after that day. Not once in the rest of that school year. I'm 31 now and I've thought about it a lot. I've looked up the history of that street, which I know sounds dramatic, but I have. I couldn't find anything specific. No accident, no event, nothing that pointed to a kid in a green jacket. Maybe there's nothing to find. Maybe Danny just didn't see what I saw for some ordinary reason I haven't figured out yet. Maybe the kid moved away and the goodbye wave was exactly what it looked like. But I'll tell you what I can't get past, and it's this: that jacket. I've searched online enough to know it was the style popular in the late 1950s and early 1960s. Not the kind of thing a kid in the early 2000s would just be wearing on a normal afternoon at a bus stop. Maybe it was a hand-me-down. Maybe his parents were just old-fashioned. Maybe? I keep landing on maybe. But every fall when the temperature drops and I smell that specific October air, I think about the corner. And I think about the wave. And I think about Danny standing right next to me, looking right at the same spot and seeing absolutely nothing at all.